Hey everyone, in this video we're going to do another short Latin story from George L. Bennett's Easy Latin Stories for Beginners. Now this is called The Fate of Polycrates, right? It's part 3 of the story of Polycrates, one of the stories from his book. And it kind of ties up the story we've been doing in the past 2 videos about Polycrates, who he was, and trying to kind of outrun his fate. Now, like I always say, whenever we use Bennett, what he's calling easy stories are not necessarily easy, and what he's calling stories for beginners, I wouldn't say are for beginners either, right? So I always try to peg it in that Latin 2 or 3 range, right? That would be my suggestion, just because there is some more advanced grammar that you're just not going to see in a Latin 1 curriculum. So you probably won't be able to read it if you're a Latin 1 student and you haven't put in a little bit of work already. Now, that being said, if you have been able to read, a lot of these stories with me in this series, or you were able to understand parts 1 and 2 of the Polycrates story, then this will be fine, right? You should be in a good place. But if you're just picking this up and you're not sure if you'll be able to kind of handle it, maybe do a little pre-reading and just see if you understand it before you dive too far in. But the reason I like to use Bennett is he has a wide variety of stories. Some are from history, like this is from Herodotus, right? It's got a historical value. Some are more about morals. Some are just short, fun little anecdotes. So it's a really wide variety of stories that help you break free from a traditional Latin textbook or curriculum and read things you normally wouldn't see, right? If you're using kind of a standard textbook, it usually follows a Roman family and they go off on their adventures or whatever the case might be. This is something different, right? Everything is very different. They're from all over the ancient world, right, particularly the ancient Greek and Roman world. And they're just fun stories, again, to kind of break out of it, okay? So like I said, in this video, we're going to finish the story of Polycrates, the tyrant of Samos, right? So in part 1, we discussed his rise to power, his conquests, and how he had this immense wealth. In part 2, right, the second video, we discussed how his excessive wealth and his greed, it worried his friend Amasis, right, the pharaoh of Egypt, and how he attempted to avoid this terrible end, right? So Amasis warns him and says, hey, people who have a ton of power and a ton of wealth, fate kind of catches up with them, right? They tend to have really horrific deaths. So Polycrates tried to avoid this by throwing away his most prized possession, which was his ring, right? Which we saw in the second video. Now, in this one, the final video, you're going to see how Polycrates is not able to outrun his fate. We'll see what happens to him, but we know, if you studied, Greek history of these stories, you know that fate is fate, right? You can't outrun it, in one way or another. It's going to catch up to you, okay? So we'll see that in this video. But before we dive in, like I always tell you, whenever you're reading these, the first thing you want to do is probably do a little pre-reading, make a vocab list, just so you have a chance of knowing what the words mean. It's really hard to read Latin if you don't know what the words actually mean. So make a vocab list, and then when you're ready to read it, try reading it out loud. If you have a classmate, partner up with them, you read it to them, have them read it back to you. This way you can work on your speaking and your pronunciation, as well as your listening skills, right? So what I'll do in the beginning is I'll read the story to you in its entirety, right, this chapter. Not that my pronunciation is anything fantastic, but if you don't have anyone to read with, at least you'll have a chance to hear it, right, from someone different and try to work on that. But you always want to bring the language to life. You never want to just translate in your head. Read it aloud. It's a language. It'll help you understand it, particularly if someone's reading it to you. That listening, that's really critical. And it'll help you just kind of really get a better grasp of the language. So I always recommend you do that, okay? So if you haven't done that, go do that, right? Go work on that first. But for now, let's read the story. Then I'll pause it, and then we'll dive in and start translating, okay? So part 3, or chapter 3 of this story goes like this. You have tum rex in Aegyptum ad Amasin literas de facto mise. Amasis autem, lectis literis valde commotus est. Itaque miso praecone samum dissolvit hospitium, quod habebat cum Polycrate iram deorum veritus. Polycrates vero brevi tempore postea ab oroite Lydiae satrape interficitur, et cadaver in cruce suspenditur. Ita nimiam felicitatem morte expiave. Okay, so let's pause the video right there. It's not a very long part of the story, right? This third chapter, we're calling a third part, is pretty short. But again, if you haven't read it on your own, read it. Use my readings if you need to hear it, or if you have a partner, again, partner up and have someone read it back to you. But try working on it and try to translate it. What we're going to do now is go through it line by line, and hopefully if your translation matches up with mine or pretty close, you can feel like you understood it, okay? So that first line, again, you have tum rex in Aegyptum ad Amasim literas de facto mise. So it's saying then the king, meaning Polycrates, right? The king sent a letter, right, to Amasis in Egypt, right, in Aegyptum. So he sends this letter to Amasis, his friend, de facto, about the event. So he's telling him, hey, good news, I tossed my ring, right? Bad news, it came back to me when someone caught a fish. So he's trying to get advice from his friend saying, what do you think about this, okay? Then you have amasis autem lectis literis valde commotus est. So you're saying amasis, however, having read the letter, right, lectis literis, with the letter having been read, you might say it's an ablative absolute, he was greatly disturbed, valde commotus est. Remember, commotus est means like moved, not physically moved, but emotionally moved. So disturbed is kind of a good way to do it. So Amasis reads this and he's like, oh my God, this guy's in trouble, right? He recognizes right away that this is not going to end well for his friend, right? So he's a little nervous, okay? Then you have itaque miso praecone samum dissolvit hospitium, quod habebat cum Polycrate iram deorum veritus. So Amasis reads this, and you have itaque, and so having sent like a praecone, a herald, right, a messenger to Samos, right, Samum to Samos, he dissolved hospitium, he dissolved the friendship. So the response from Amasis is to say, this guy is screwed. I don't want to be associated with him anymore. He's like, nope, good luck, buddy. I can tell already this is not going to go well. So he sends a messenger saying, hey, it's been fun. I appreciated all the good times, but now we're not going to talk anymore. Okay, so he dissolved the friendship, quote, habebat cum Polycrate, right, which he had with Polycrates, right? So he's like, nope, we're good. Why does he do this? Veritus iram deorum, right? He's fearing, right? Veritus, fearing the anger of the gods. So he's afraid that if he's associated with this doomed man, he's going to have something bad happen to him. So he quits. He's like, nah, I'm good, right? We're not going to deal with this. Then you have Polycrates, vero brevi tempore postea ab oroite Lydiae satrape interficitur, right? So this first part, you're saying Polycrates in a short time, brevi tempore, right? So in a short time after, you might say, interficitur, he is killed, or he was killed by Oroites, right? Ab oroite. So he gets killed by this man Oroites, who's the satrape Lydia, the satrap of Lydia. Now, satrap is an interesting term. You see this a lot when you're looking at the area of what the Greeks would have called like Persia. A satrap is sort of a leader. I don't know if governor is the right word, but that's probably kind of a good way of doing it. It's how they divided up the different regions. So you can almost think of it as like the governor of Lydia, right? So we're talking about modern day Turkey, basically. So this neighboring satrap, Oroites, kills him, right? Well, that's kind of the bad fate that came from the ring, right? He died. Then you have the second part, which is kind of horrific. You have et cadaver in cruce suspenditur. So not only does he kill him, but his body was hung on a cross, right? So they crucify him. So it's either they crucify him or they just hang his body up as a warning, right? So there's a famous painting you can see down here of Polycrates, right? His fate. So at the end of the day, Amasis warned him saying, hey, man, this isn't going to go well, right? Bad things happen to people with this much wealth and power. And that's exactly what happens to Polycrates, right? He tries to escape it. Didn't work. Okay. And then you have the last line. You have ita nimiam felicitatem morte expiavit. So thus, right, ita, thus he atoned for, so expiavit, he atoned for is probably the best way to do it. He atoned for his excessive felicitatem, his excessive good fortune, right? Nimiam felicitatem, right? So all that good stuff, his wealth, his power, he atoned for it morte, with his death, right? With death. So this is how he gets his punishment, right? Too much of a good thing, not good. So this kind of reminds me, I don't know why this popped in my mind, but a few years ago, if you happen to be right in the US and a football fan, there was a famous quote from Mark Cuban, might think of him Shark Tank, where he said, pigs get fat, hogs get slaughtered. And he was talking about the NFL and how they keep getting too much of a good thing. That's what always comes to mind when I read about Polycrates. Cuban's not the first one to say this, but a lot of people do say that, right? You can have too much of a good thing. Be careful, right? So when you say pigs get fat, that means like it's okay to have wealth and some, but hogs get slaughtered. That means if you go too far, it's not going to go well. That's kind of what happens with Polycrates and what the Greeks are getting at here with this story, right? You're allowed to have power, you're allowed to have wealth, but if you take it too far, bad things will happen. That's what Amasis warned, and that's exactly what happens to Polycrates, right? So it's a great story about the warning of having too much stuff, right? Too much power, too much wealth. It usually doesn't end well. And you can't outrun your fate. We've seen this in a lot of videos we've read on this channel. But whenever you're dealing with fate, right, if your fate is set, it's very difficult to get away from it. It's going to catch you one way or another. Okay? So that kind of ends the arc of Polycrates. It's a fun story. It's a little bit of a longer one in Bennett. If you're actually using his textbook, this is in what he calls part 2. So it's meant to be more of a challenging story. And I'd say it is, right, for again, not necessarily for a beginner, but if you're in that Latin 2 or 3 range, somewhere in there, hopefully it wasn't too bad to read. It made some sense. If you have any questions about it or anything you're worried about, put it in the comments below. I'm always happy to help. explain something if I either translated it wrong or read it wrong, whatever it might be. Tell me, I'll explain it to you. But otherwise, hopefully, it was a nice break from whatever you're normally reading in your Latin journey, and it made some sense. Okay, and if you're stuck on it, it didn't quite lock in, just keep reading it. Right, do the read and reread method I always tell you to do. Just keep practicing it and reading it over and over again until it kind of sinks in for you and makes sense, and that's how you know you're ready to move on. Good luck with it.